He is a front-end engineer and accessibility specialist at Facebook. And we're delighted to have her talking at ID24 on a subject of particular interest to me, which is scaling accessibility improvements in large organizations. If you've got any questions for Jessie, please tweet them with the hashtag ID24. And now I'll hand you over to Jessie.
Hello, everyone. Good morning for those of you for whom it is morning. So I, as mentioned, I'm here at Facebook. I've been here for about 2 years. And during that time, I feel like I've had a pretty intense education in what it means to work at scale. So I'm sure that a lot of people out there sometimes feel like you work on an accessibility maintenance crew. You spend most of your time, fixing bugs and fixing issues, but you never really get to the point of, building new features. And what we're really trying to do at Facebook is to, migrate our team from a maintenance team to a product team. We want to get to the point where we have the time to focus on greenfield designs, new interaction patterns, and such. But we have to admit and recognize that Facebook and a lot of other companies are big and they're very busy. To give you a sense of what that scale of bigness and busyness is like, we have thousands of engineers at Facebook building hundreds of products and features. Each one of those teams has the autonomy to work in any way they like. They can set their own goals. They can write their own code. No one's required to use any standard here, although there are standards that people prefer to use because they're well supported. So React, as an example, is a standard that we use because it's a well-supported framework for building front-end user interfaces. Speaking of React, the last time I counted, and this is just a rough estimate, we have over 42,000 React components in our code base. And I've gone back in time and done some measurement of the growth of that React code base over time. And sticking with Moore's number or Moore's law, magically, that number has doubled about every 18 months. So you could imagine that the number of problems in the code base in terms of accessibility has sort of roughly doubled every 18 months, or would if no one was paying attention to those things. So you might think that with the doubling of the code base, we would just simply double our team size to keep up with that growth. But when I think about growing a team, I think about an analogy from the early 20th century. So let's take a moment and think back to the days of the original switchboards for telephones. Back in the day, there were maybe 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 telephones in the country, and it was possible to connect people directly. A human did this by connecting 2 wires or taking a wire and connecting it into 2 ports to connect those 2 people together so they could speak. If you take that model and scale it up to the current population of, let's just say, the United States at like 300 million people or so, we would be employing half the population of the United States to switch calls for the other half making them. So when you think about the complexity of a system, there comes a point where scaling up the people is no longer a viable solution. You literally have to scale the impact that every person has in order to keep up with that rate of scaling. So what it came down to is we realized that we just simply have to grow the impact of our team. We can't just continue to add people or add headcount. Let's go forward here. So we spent some time and we asked ourselves, why don't we have time to focus on innovation within our team? And we came up with a few reasons and then some solutions to those. And it's the solutions to those reasons that I want to go through. So we'll touch on each one. There's about 5 to give you a sense of the topics we're going to run through. So one of the first reasons we don't have time to focus on accessibility is there's simply too few experts within our company, within the world. There just aren't enough people that are writing front-end code or writing software that understand the principles of accessibility and are able to incorporate them, easily into their day-to-day work. So we have, minimal or no accessibility development knowledge. within a certain population of our developers, and this just leads to countless simple errors within the code base. So the solution to this is to simply make everyone an expert, which sounds a bit flip, but we thought, can we do this? Are there tools available to us that could at least make every developer at our company sort of a baseline expert, whether they know they are or not? So the first thing we looked at is a concept of strong typing in JavaScript. Now, I'm sure a lot of you out there know that JavaScript is notoriously loosey-goosey with its typing. Beyond the basic primitives, we really don't have types. We have number and string and object, but we don't even have a type for an array. So when it comes to complex typing of classes or objects, it's just not possible with the basic JavaScript. So here at Facebook, we use a project called Flow that allows us to specify arbitrary types and then to incorporate those into our code. So our team thought, what if we take some of the concepts from the specification and incorporate those into types so we could at least limit the set of values that someone might, for example, assign to the role attribute. So on the screen here, we have a type called ARIA composite widget role, and that's being exported. So any other module in our system can use that type. And this type is a list of strings, and these are the values that correspond to the widget roles. We have combo box, grid, list box, menu, menu bar, radio group, tab list, tree, tree grid. And when we associate the type ARIA composite widget role with a property on one of our components in our interface, we essentially limit the values that are allowed for that property to this list of tokens. We can also take types and sort of combine them into larger types. So within our system, we have an ARIA role type, which is a combination of ARIA widget role, ARIA composite widget role, ARIA document structure role, and ARIA landmark role. So to look at one of these ARIA roles in action, these types in action, let's look at an example. So on the screen, I have a bit of code. The first line is a declaration of the default properties that this, in this case, a React component is allowed to have. This default properties is an object with one property. The property name is role, and its type is ARIA role. So in the second line, I have the definition of a component, this class called typeAheadList. And this class extends the React component, which is something we call a polymorphic object. And this polymorphic object takes default properties, and state as its three polymorphic components. And what we do is we associate the type for our default props to the default props static property on this component. And then when we're rendering or sort of returning HTML from the component, we're able to know that the role property on the div that's being returned can only have values that come from the list of roles that we've defined in that type. So just to highlight a couple of these things again, we've got the ARIA role type, and that corresponds to, at the bottom, this.props.role, the value being passed into this component from the outside. And in this case, you can see that we've given it a default property of listbox. So if no property or value is passed in for that attribute, then it's going to get listbox as the value. So let's look at a slightly extended example where we have now started to create a kind of API for our components using typing. So in this case, we're defining a props type object, and there's one property on it called label. And the value of this label can only be a string. We can't pass in a Boolean, or we can't pass in numbers. We have to pass in a string. What we're doing here is creating an abstract button that, again, extends component. And in the render method that returns HTML, you can see we're returning a button, and we are rendering that value of the label property within the children of the button. So this is going to be a content, a button labeled by content. So you might imagine that this abstract button is used to create buttons within a product. So we have a further component here called button. It itself returns an abstract button, which then renders down to an HTML button element. But you'll notice that we're not passing in a label property on this component here, on the abstract button. So within our system, either within the development environment or within our build system, when we go to build this application, we're going to get an error from Flow that says we're missing the label property on the abstract button. So if we add that property and pass it a valid value, in this case a string, save, we've now satisfied the type of abstract button, and we can check that code in. So using types, we can essentially enforce these arbitrary APIs on the components within our system. Another thing we've done with typing is to build some smarts directly into React.js itself. This is something I worked on a few months ago. Because there is a known and small set of ARIA attributes, the states and properties within the specification, we can, within React itself, enforce that no one adds an invalid, a misspelled or a property or state that doesn't exist. They don't add that to one of their components and produce invalid markup when it gets rendered down to HTML. So if you do try that, you're going to get a warning when you load your application that just says that you're trying to render a DOM element with an ARIA property that does not exist. And we even provide some suggestions. So if you've misspelled described by or labeled by, maybe forgot an L and labeled by, it'll suggest the correct spelling to you in the error. All of that is sort of limited to the world of JavaScript, and perhaps even more specifically to React and JavaScript XML or JSX. Within the world of PHP, if you're using XHP to represent your HTML output, there's an opportunity as well to enforce typing within XHP. So in the case of, let's say, ARIA expanded, here on the page, we've got a div with ARIA label, a data ID. It's got the ARIA expanded attribute on it, ARIA active descendant, maybe some click functionality, what have you. We're passing in a value to ARIA expanded, a value of true, which within our system at Facebook for a while was composing down to 1. So we've gone in and specified that you have to pass in a string for that value. You can't pass in a Boolean. And again, just like in React, if you happen to misspell, let's say, descendant, you spell dent, D-E-N-T, instead of D-A-N-T. I think I'm spelling that right. I always misspell that word. The XHP typing system can also come up, provide an error, and warn you that you've misspelled the word. Let me go back really quickly. So typing gets us pretty far in terms of allowing us to limit the values that get passed in to specific attributes on our components. But it has its limits. It requires a developer to sort of go in and define what that type should be, and then to explicitly state that on the component during the development process. It still didn't get us far enough in our system, and we've still found that we were spending time fixing errors within our code base. So one of the problems we still face is that there are still too few experts. There's not enough people at our company that know enough about typing to go ahead and put those types in place. That still requires time from our team. So we looked to a different technology, something that's called Linting, to see if we could further take our knowledge and put it into our development environment here at Facebook. So linting is a way of providing contextual feedback before code gets committed. And you're probably familiar with some of the linting tools out there. There's ESLint, JSLint, JSHint, and even sort of more style-focused linters like JSCS. Here at Facebook, we use ESLint within our environment. If you want to sort of conceptualize where linting fits in the testing process, we can think of our testing process as being a pyramid, kind of like a food pyramid. At the top, we've got the manual tests. These are the most expensive things we can write and perform. They require a human. They take a lot of time. They're not done very often. After that, we have end-to-end tests. These are tests that are usually testing over a system that involve many different components of that. So you might be testing your login flow or your payment flow. They usually involve something like a WebDriver. Do those tests, again, pretty expensive in terms of time. Integration tests are a little less expensive, thus we tend to have more of them. These tend to happen below the level of maybe WebDriver, but could also incorporate something like that. Unit tests are the tests that test a function and really are limited in scope, but are highly useful, and they're not very expensive to write or run. And I'd like to think of linting rules as being even below unit tests on the pyramid, because they're project agnostic. A unit test really needs to be written for a specific project. We can write linting rules that have nothing to do with any particular company's code, but apply just as well. So let's look at an example. Here we have on the screen an li element with an on-click handler that calls some function when there's a click, and it has text content, just the word save. So developer is developing, and the linting system kicks in with an error that says static elements should not have mouse or keyboard event listeners. What it's saying is, if you have an li element, you really shouldn't be listening for events on this li element. It's not meant to be a host of event handling. So our developer has a little bit of knowledge of ARIA, or maybe reads the documentation on the error and says, you know what, I'll just make this a button. That way I can put a click handler on it. But our linter jumps in again and says that non-interactive elements like an li element should not be given interactive roles. You shouldn't be changing the role of an li element in order to put interactivity on it. So our developer, who is pretty clever, goes ahead and takes the role button attribute and puts it on a div inside the li element. So now we're putting something inside the container, which seems like a pretty good idea. But our linter jumps in again and says, if you're going to have an interactive element, if you're going to say that a div is a button, then you have to put a tab index on this div so that it can be reached via the keyboard. And we can start to be a little clever about this and get at the intent of what the developer is trying to do. We have a lint rule that just says, use a button element instead. If you really need this thing to be clickable, just use the native HTML element. There's no reason to go recreating the whole thing out of divs. So on the screen, I have an example from my development environment where one of these errors is showing up. We see just some code in the editor. There are the line numbers going down the left-hand side from 200 to 208. On the screen, there's a div. It has class name and an on-click event. And over next to the line number for the div is a little yellow triangle. The triangle in our system indicates that there's a warning. Our development environment is trying to tell you that there's something wrong with your code here. So if you go over and investigate that warning, it says visible non-interactive elements with click handlers must have a role attribute. And again, this is going to start that whole process that we saw before of progressive errors that lead the developer to build a piece of HTML that's going to have at least the minimum requirements for being interactive and accessible. that we can interpret at this stage in the development. So we have all of these rules rolled up into an open source plugin. It's called the ESLint plugin for JSX Alley. It's available on GitHub. You can go and incorporate it into your development environment today. We did some major improvements to it over the January, February, March timeframe, and we have a good number of the rules running live on the Facebook codebase today. And I've just spent the past couple of weeks interpreting the results of those, and we're seeing sort of a leveling off of the introduction of errors even as our code base grows, which is a good sign. So you'd think with typing and linting that at this point most of our day is just reading Facebook and watching as developers write perfectly accessible code, but you'd be amiss in that. There's still too much to fix. So typing and linting work really well for preventing errors from getting into the code base, but they don't fix the errors that are there unless a developer opens a file, sees that warning, and then makes the change. What we really want to do is use our understanding of the errors that exist, go back and fix them automatically. So we can use this technique called codemodding to do this. Codemodding allows us to fix problems all at once. For instance, we went back in our code base and we labeled over 900 buttons using this technique. We have buttons on internal products, external products, things that have been deprecated. It's hard to tell what exactly that button is for, but it doesn't really matter when you can just go back and over the course of a few weeks just apply labels to everything. We fixed over 2,000 linting violations during this particular time when we were doing this work. I'm happy to take questions at the end of this as well about how we did that labeling. I know I just kind of glossed over. You're thinking, how do you add a label to something if you don't know what it does? We got pretty clever. We also involved some humans. Talk a little bit more about that in a little while. This project itself, this code modding project called JS CodeShift, is available from the Facebook GitHub repository if you want to explore it. I found it to be daunting for the first day. And then after that, I fell into a good rhythm. And at this point, I feel like I write more code that writes code than I write code. It's really a powerful technique to have in your toolbox. So to give you an example of what you can do with code modding, this is a trivial example, but it's kind of fun. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have a class, a JavaScript class called MyButton. It has a render method that just returns a little div. And what we can do with code modding is go in and say, find all the identifiers, anything that within the code base maps to this concept of an identifier. And that is a particular type of thing in what we call the abstract syntax tree. It's a representation of the JavaScript file as a traversable tree. In this case, we've taken the identifier MyButton and we've just reversed all the letters. So it's spelled N-O-T-T-U-B-Y-M. It's not very useful, but you can see that you can go into a file, find something very specific in it, and then change it and write that file back out. To give you an example of what one of these transform files looks like, on the screen I have a little bit of code. It's defining a function called transformer. Within JS CodeShift, our transform function is passed the file that we're going to work on. And we're also given an API object that allows us or gives us methods to essentially modify that file that we're given. So this particular transform is for the code reversal or the identifier reversal that we just saw in the previous slide. We're going to find all the identifiers on the page, go through each one of them, and just replace it with the name of that identifier reversed. Pretty simple file. It's maybe 10 lines. And we could go through those 42,000 components and reverse all the identifiers in them in about 5 minutes. So why are we doing this now all of a sudden? And why weren't we code modding, like 10 years ago? And it comes down to just a fortuitous confluence of particular capabilities within the JavaScript world. So we have extensible parsers now, like Babylon and TypeScript, that we didn't have 2 years ago. They allow us to understand what is intended or what a JavaScript file represents, and to represent that in the abstract syntax tree that I mentioned before, this structure that we can inspect and traverse. We have a community focused on defining these abstract syntax tree definitions. So identifier is a thing inside of a JavaScript file, and there are hundreds of similar type things, like a function expression or a value assignment. All of these things have to be named and defined given properties so they can be understood. We have pretty printers like Recast and more recently Prettier that can take that abstract syntax tree and turn it back into a JavaScript file. And we also have this friendly modding library, JS CodeShift, which is a little bit like jQuery, if you remember working with that, where you have methods like parent and children and next sibling. You can move up and down this tree and then act on nodes in that tree. So now that we can prevent new errors from going in and go back and fix some of the errors, you'd think that our day was pretty simple and easy at this point. But again, you'd be wrong. What ends up happening is we just have so many solutions to things at Facebook. People building UIs constantly, building new interaction patterns, building a particular component that their team might need. So what we have done here is we've really invested in this idea of reusable components. We saw before an example of an abstract button that then can be composed with a particular button for a product. Once you have a bunch of these components, you need a way to find them. So if we look at an example of like one of these components, we have on the screen an icon button. The icon button has 3 attributes: an icon attribute, a label attribute, and a label is hidden attribute. The purpose of this is to show that this abstracted API for this icon button can be used to output the HTML in any number of ways. At the bottom of the screen, there's a span. That span has an ARIA label save. Inside the span is an image. We might also output the label for this particular icon button as a span with text content. We could output this as just a button element. What we're doing is we're abstracting away from the particulars of the HTML that are being produced in this component and presenting a developer with a very simple and predictable set of properties on a component that they just have to satisfy. The component team that's building the components can figure out the best way to produce the HTML and spit that out to the browser. So I mentioned before that once we start building a bunch of components, we have to be able to surface them, to allow teams to find them, to use them in their product development process. So we have this thing called the Component Explorer. It's an internal tool, but it doesn't do much more than index the existing list of components in our system and allow for developers to create example files that show how these components should be used or how they could be used given all the different properties that may exist on that component. What our team did is we went through and we audited a bunch of the commonly used components after looking at logs to see which components were rendered the most, or doing searches in the code base to see which were incorporated into the most products. We just went through and we evaluated whether or not the output of that component would be accessible if it needed a bit of extra attention from the developer to make it accessible. Here you can see we have an accessibility section on this page for the component that includes a green checkmark little bit and has the word accessible there. And it says to the developer that labels are always required in buttons for accessibility. For icon-only buttons, use the label as hidden property to hide the label text. And then for advice on writing meaningful labels, we link to an article within our internal documentation system. The rest of the page just lists the properties on that button that the developer can use and types a bit of technical information. We also did the opposite for components that we know are just not good to use. So in this case, we have a popover, and the accessibility section for this component has a red X with the word inaccessible next to it. And it says, this component UI popover does not have accessible behaviors built in. And we provided the developer with 3 alternative components that they could use instead to build a UI that they want to build. So now we've prevented new errors from going in. We've fixed a bunch of the existing errors. We've provided information about the good components to use versus the bad components, and we're constantly going back in as a team and trying to fix the broken components. For instance, this UI popover, I went in this past quarter and made a lot of improvements to it. At this point, we probably could go back and say that it is a preferred component. You'd think our day was filled with extra time to read and stroll in the park. But what it ends up coming down to is we still have too many teaching moments within our organization. We've provided as much information as we can to developers, but if they have zero awareness of even the field or the concept of accessibility coming into Facebook, they may not understand the gravity of what we're trying to express to them through these errors and through these component libraries. So in order to intervene at the moment where they're fixing a bug or they're working on a task, we decided to get into the task system itself. We've used this internal tool that we have called Milo Bot. A lot of chat systems and other ticket managing systems have a similar tool that you can use, where you can write scripts for a bot that can respond to different rules. In our case, we went in and wrote some rules based on task searches. So any task that has to do with focus or task that has to do with labeling. We've written these bots that jump in and just add comments into the task itself. So to give you an example of what one of these comments looks like, here we have a Milo bot that has jumped in on a task having to do with focus. And it adds a comment that says, for more information about managing focus to support accessible interactions on the web, see, and then there's a link to some internal documentation. We've been tracking the clicks into these links internally inside of our development teams. And we've noticed that when new classes of bootcampers come in, the clicks on these links tend to go up as folks are getting their first tasks and working on these issues. We also wanted to address some of the issues of what we call reprioritizing. So we have a bot that jumps in and tags any high priority task with the tag. Just says, accessibility high pri on it. And anytime that a high pri task gets downgraded to mid or low pri, our Milo bot or accessibility bot jumps in with a link to the page where we describe our criteria for prioritization of accessibility issues. We just want the project managers to understand that there are certain levels of priority that different tasks and issues have. And if they're making this judgment call without having read that document, it could be the case that they're prioritizing a high pri issue for mid or low pri. And again, it just provides information at the moment where they're having to make that choice. So we've got these bots intervening when folks are working on tasks specifically, but how do we get them, when they're coming into Facebook to work on these tasks? we still have a problem of too little awareness. Our interventions are predicated on some external project manager assigning a task to one of their developers. If we could intervene on day one and get these developers to understand that accessibility is a top-line priority at Facebook and to know a little bit more about the fields, we would have them moving forward in their careers with this information from day one. So what we decided to do is to work with the Bootcamp program here at Facebook, which is a 6 to 8 week training for new engineering hires and project managers and data analysts. Everyone goes through it. We created over 200 labeling tasks. So I mentioned before that we went back and we created 900, or we fixed 900 button labels. Those we did through heuristics by looking at class names and looking at icon names, going through and adding in text that corresponded to those class or icon names and reviewing it to make sure that we thought the association was correct. But there was still a large number of buttons that we just couldn't label automatically. We needed a human to intervene. So we turned those into tasks and we put them into the bucket for our bootcampers. And what we're finding is that these bootcampers come in and they, the first task they get at Facebook is to add a label to a button. And I and my colleague, Tatiana Iskandar, are the people of contact, or the person of contact on that task. And you'll find developers messaging you saying, why is this task necessary? Why are we doing this? And we get a moment to explain to them what labeling means for accessibility. We introduce them to our documentation. And I found that developers feel like they've kind of woken up to a field or to an area of interest that just wasn't known to them or wasn't prioritized. And I've had these developers come back months later to me with questions about some larger issue they're working on within their code base. They know who I am, we have a relationship, and we can now work on really complex UI. It's something that they feel empowered to do and they want to do. So at this point, I'm going to allow everyone to celebrate, especially here on our team. Through these interventions, we really have found that we've gained back some of our time. As we're going into planning for the next half, we have more of our day-to-day to focus on some projects that allow us to build new UI and to really get into the development process and fix some pretty thorny issues, working on testing and whatnot. So if we just step back and think about what we learned, the thing you have to do within your development process is give yourself the chance and the time to identify where you're spending most of your time. We spent a year just kind of rushing to keep up with the deluge of tasks and tickets. And it wasn't until we stepped back, took a moment, and thought about how to solve the problem at the scale of thousands instead of tens or hundreds, that I think we were able to really make a leap forward in our day-to-day exigencies. And when you do that, you win back your time. You get to spend it on product development rather than maintenance tasks. And that is it.
That was really great, Jesse. Thanks very much. We have one question from Twitter, which is about a specific example. It's from Scott Winkle. Why have ARIA label as well as the text label in the span for the icon button example? Yeah,
good question. I probably could have explained that better. The point of that slide, and I probably need to go back and fix it, is to just show that the output is disconnected from the component that passes in the properties. So we ask a developer to pass in a label. We don't ask them to decide how that label is going to be put into the HTML. And we can make that decision based on whether or not it's going to be displayed visually. We can even change it over time as practice changes if necessary. But that doesn't change the product itself. The component properties are going to remain the same.
Okay, that's great. I've got a question as well. I don't see any more questions on Twitter, but if you have any, please get there quickly. I think it's really a good idea that what you're doing sounds fantastic in terms of fixing these problems at the source, as it were, for developers with the linting tool. And I really like Milo Bot. I think that would have been a great thing to have. But I'm also interested in whether you are doing anything similar for designers, UI or UX designers, and how you're sort of fixing problems before they hit development.
Yeah, so there are really two great intervention points in the development process if you want to get in as early as possible. And the first is developers, as they're typing their code. And the second is designers. And I'm sure you would agree, if you can intervene at the design stage, you're often intervening even before the developer gets in there. We definitely have that on our roadmap. We saw the remediation of the code to be the easiest place to start.
Yeah.
And it became evident as we were working with these tools, Flow and ESLint, that we didn't just have the opportunity to identify problems before they happened. We had the ability to go back and fix them in the existing code. And what we're trying to do now is to track our tasks over time to see if tasks for unfocusable, unlabeled, lacking interaction, if those types of tasks taper off or decrease over time. And if we see that trend, we'll feel like we have the opportunity to focus on some design tools because the existing end user experience is improving over time. We can then focus on what's coming next.
Yeah. So get a good baseline first and then improve.
Yeah, and we can measure its health over time. We talk about our code base in terms of quality and health. And unless we can count the errors and understand the trends within the code base, we can't know if we should be firefighting or, building.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic that you've released these tools as well. I'm really interested in those, and I'll definitely be looking into them.
Just, I have a question, if I may.
Go ahead, Ian.
Oh, go ahead, give her a hand.
I was just wondering, you mentioned the training that you're giving new hires, and that was very extensive. Have you noticed any improvement into the level of knowledge for the people coming in? Like, is there any improvement in how these new hires were educated before they joined Facebook? Do you notice any trends of accessibility becoming more of a common knowledge set, or is it basically staying the same or even getting worse?
So anecdotally, I do a lot of interviewing, and I'm involved with our Bootcamp program pretty much all the time. I have noticed an increase in experience and awareness. So we're getting developers who at a previous job were the expert in accessibility at their company. We're also getting developers who come in who may have worked in a side project or have a little bit of experience, but once they find out that they can take that side project or that side interest and make it a focus here, they become the person on their team that does that work. And when I identify these people, I bring them into another set of rules that we have for assigning reviewers to pull requests or to changes. So if one of these changes matches a certain rule, there's a group of 10 developers who automatically get assigned as reviewers so that they're constantly getting hit with a stream of changes, and they feel like they can exercise their knowledge and apply it, and they get recognized as the experts within the company for that.
Yeah, I've noticed a similar pattern in some of the interviews that I've been part of, where people just seem to have, some previous experience where they dealt with accessibility sometimes. Another question I had, at the end of the road, would you prefer the developers to have as little knowledge of ARIA, that the tool does everything for them, or would you want them to have as much knowledge of ARIA as they can, where they have to manually apply things and know which things are possible? So in how much, what's the level of taking the knowledge out of their hands and doing it automatically for them, and with all these validators and checkers that you're applying?
Such a good question. Well, I know the bounds. I know that I don't want everyone to have zero knowledge. And I know that I don't want every one of my developers typing the word ARIA - into their code every day, because that is a recipe for disaster. There's just too many nuances to using the properties and states that can, it's just tribal knowledge. It takes a little while to get it right.
It's very easy
so the reason why
wrong.
Yeah, totally. What I'd like is for the majority of folks to just interact with our components through this abstract API on the properties. They have to provide a label, and for the most part, that's usually good enough for what they're doing. We might expose error state information, like error messages and things like that through that API that they have to provide. If everyone did that, I would be totally satisfied. I do want a smaller set of folks who understand the nuances of ARIA on the web, so that our team is never the only source of consultation for that. But I don't think it needs to be everybody, and probably shouldn't be.
Right. Leonie, did you have any questions?
Yes. So Jesse, it's clear that at Facebook, you and the team, you've accomplished an extraordinary amount, not least given the size of the organization that you're working with. If you could offer some advice for teams within other sort of similar sized organizations, or even perhaps smaller ones, where to kind of start, what would the first step that you recommend be for other people trying to put in place some of the stuff that you have done?
So if you are using Lint and React, grab the ESLint plugin that we're building. We've got folks at Airbnb and Twitter and a couple other companies working on this. It's a pretty wide set of folks. And just install it and turn it on. We're constantly working on that, and I'm running those rules over tens of thousands of components to see how the results shake out. So when I turn it on, it's got to work. I've got developers who are yelling if it doesn't.
Right.
Yeah. Any friction you have someone's day. So yeah, that's the easy part. Building components and essentially baking your knowledge into a common solution. That's what you're doing with components. Like convincing your team that writing raw HTML, either in a file or in some markup language, is going to make your life difficult down the road when you have to update or make changes.
And in Facebook, I don't know if you're allowed to talk to this, but does Facebook sort of hope for, expect, require any degree of kind of accessibility knowledge in its recruits?
We hope for, certainly. I think what we've tried to do is address this as we might any issue that has to do with inclusivity and diversity, is to really look at the pipeline and the education process and to make it a priority for the cadre of students that are in school now. I think it's the reason why we're invested in the Teach Access project, to get universities to make accessibility a part of their CS programs. And for us, personally, I want to see this specialty and this field of knowledge made known at the time of CS education.
Yep. Yeah, we absolutely agree with you. And TPG, obviously another member of the Teach Access Initiative. So yeah, we're totally on the same page there about doing as much as we can in education. And it's great that, yep, Facebook, Yahoo, and many universities are on board with that same idea, definitely.
All right, well, thank you very much, Jesse. We've just about reached the end of the time that we have. So it was a great talk. I learned a lot about automating, using ARIA and be compliant. So thanks again. And if anybody has any questions, they'll know where to find you on Twitter.
Twitter, come talk to me on GitHub in the issue queues if you find issues or want to make improvements. It's a great way to learn a bit about JavaScript, and our team is there to consult and collaborate with.
All right, we'll be back in about 10 minutes with Cynthia Shelley and her 52 usability studies in a CSUN booth. See you in 10 minutes.